So now to the exciting part of the afternoon, and I just want to welcome members of the general public who've come to join us. We're really pleased that we've been able to attract a broader audience than the specialists that work on food security. Now I know in part that's because we have Rex here, and we're very excited that Rex agreed to join us for the second time at this conference. He did a marvelous job introducing and moderating a debating question the last time around, and I'm sure we will have just as much fun and swashbuckling this time as we did the last time around. So what I would like to do is just introduce the debaters for the afternoon, because I know them a bit better than Rex does, and then once I've done that, I think I can hand over. We'll say a little bit about how we run the debate, and then I can hand over, and Rex will take over as moderator. So I'll just go. Basically, I'll go from my left to right. Okay. So over here we've got Professor Dick Flavell. And Dick Flavell is the chair of one of the major international wheat genomic initiatives right now, the Wheat Yield Consortium, or the Wheat Yield Partnership now. Yeah, they changed the name. And Dick previously was the CEO and executive director at the John Innes Centre in Britain, which is one of the greatest plant science institutes in the entire world. So we're very pleased to have you on board, Dick. Next to Dick is Merit Tereski, and Merit has come to us from the University of Guelph. She's an eminent scientist in the area of carbon cycling in holistic large landscape systems. And as you can see from the title of the debate, we need somebody who can really take that on and talk to us a little bit about the complexity of the carbon flux between terrestrial systems and the air. So thank you very much, Merit, for coming from the University of Guelph. On this side of the table, we have Hannah Tuomisto. Hannah gave a great talk earlier on today on the topic, really, of what we're talking about today. Hannah is a professor in the University of Helsinki in Finland, so she's also come a very long way. But she has published many papers on basically the carbon footprint of agricultural systems, and done some very good quantitative work to look at interventions in agriculture and how that impacts on both the energetic and carbon flux between the farming system and the atmosphere. And then finally, one of our own, Stuart Smythe, and Stuart is an agricultural economist in our College of Agriculture and Bioresources. Stuart works very closely with the Global Institute for Food Security and has helped us greatly, although we have very good science, experimental science. What Stuart has been able to do is to turn, as a social scientist and economist, turn many of our ideas into questions about social interactions with the general public, acceptability of certain types of technology, and also to get a sense as to many of these technologies. We have no idea how much they might be worth, and it requires a good economist to be able to quantify those things. So we're very pleased that Stuart has agreed to be one of our debaters. And then finally, let me just introduce, although he needs no real introduction, our moderator for today, Rex Murphy. Rex is, as you know, a TV and newspaper journalist. He's been widely cited as the most intellectual journalist in Canada, and that's not just me saying it, but other people. What I always remember about Rex, because you may may have heard him either on the national or on the radio. He's got one of the best vocabularies of any journalist that I've interacted with over the years, and sometimes I've had to get a Webster's dictionary out to find out what that word actually meant. So, but he was a Rhodes Scholar, studied in Oxford, so he obviously came by this broad vocabulary very honestly. So it's a real privilege to have our debaters and Rex here once again at this interesting debate. Now, I'll just say a couple of words about an IQ squared debate, and Rex will probably elaborate on this. And I'm going to leave you to actually call the question, right, Rex? Is that okay? So, which is right on our crib sheet here. IQ square debates are a little bit different from what you might call the normal swashbuckling debates that we would have in Parliament, where you basically end up just deciding, is the motion passed or is it not? And, you know, if you've got a large enough majority in Parliament, you win. An IQ squared debate is a lot more nuanced, and really what we're hoping to do is to measure the ability of our debaters to persuade you from your current position to whatever position you end up with. And for that reason, what we're going to do, and if we can just show the website now behind me on the screen, anybody who's got a cell phone, a smartphone, if you can log in to this SurveyMonkey address, what you will find is the opportunity now to vote on this proposition. And the proposition, I'm not sure if it's actually on the website, so I'm going to tell you. Agriculture and forestry hold the solution to mitigating atmospheric CO2 and climate change. Okay, I'll say it again, because the proponents will be arguing that agriculture and forestry hold the solution to mitigating atmospheric CO2 and climate change. Now, you can vote, and this is now before you've heard any debate. You can vote for the proposition, against it, or you can be not sure. The value of this debate is we're going to keep the results hidden. You just vote on them. You won't hear what the results of the pre-debate vote is until we've finished, but we'll take the vote at the end after we've had the debate. And when we do, can everybody see the screen? And then when we do, we'll see just how much opinion has shifted. Now that is a measure of the quality of the discourse, and that's a much more important factor for us. So we're going to leave that up there. We're going to give you 2 or 3 minutes to vote. But now what I'm going to do is hand over to Rex. And what I'll do, Rex, is just give you a signal when we're going to turn this off so the voting will be finished. But if you would like to take over, I'll be quiet.
Morris has done some savage injustice here. He's referred to me as an intellectual journalist, which is, of course, pure paradox and oxymoron. It belongs in the same camp as the military intelligence. You've heard of that before. And also, of course, as far as being a journalist is concerned, that's not a justified description. I bear the same relationship to journalism as a streetwalker has to the Department of Highways. I give you these fragments of my Oprah background merely to let you know the capacity in which I am present here today. You see joining me here for distinctly qualified, intelligent, earnestly and correctly credentialed experts in their fields, and of capacity and genuine intelligence. So it was thought it was necessary to have a counter presence during this exchange. And so I'm here as essentially the anticlimax and the turnstile through which real wisdom and knowledge will flow. A few things about the debate. I think Morris missed perhaps the contrast that's going on here. This type of debate is formal. There are time limits for the speakers of 10 minutes apiece in their presentation for affirmative or negative, and then one each gets 5 minutes in rebuttal or summary at the end. Now this differs and I think to its disadvantage, actually, from the parliamentary debates that Morris alluded to, or even the leadership debates, at least here in Canada we have. And I'll just give you a few places where they actually do, we actually miss something. In this particular debate, you'll be able to hear the speakers as they talk. Yes. And they will also, in the majority, and I'm certain in this case, the totality of instances, present a detailed, reasonable, argued presentation. They will not be marred by talking points, by artificial screams of rage or shame, and by gibbering overtalk when one of the speakers loses his or her position. In other words, they will be confined to the question. They will attempt to have some respect for the language. They will speak to the point, and therefore, in terms of political debate, they will be unlike any other that you have heard before. And so it's a challenge to moderate something as special as that. I am a fan of the old-fashioned ones. I don't know, I'm just killing time while you take advantage of the thing to load your iPhones. I saw Mr. Smythe over there busily voting already. I don't know what he's doing, but he's very clever at it. We miss the quality of old-fashioned debates, and especially this is true quite literally at this instant. It's almost like the great collision of the planetary orbs and the cosmological collapse when the Twitter feed met the presence of Mr. Trump, and suddenly all human knowledge was exploded and scattered into a wide void. So I miss the old-fashioned ones when you could actually, as I said, you actually listen to the person who had prepared his or her thoughts and argued them with dispassion and respect to reason. Also, there was a touch of elegance in those old days. I'm gambling in my mind, even as I mutter away up here, whether I could tell you the most brutal parliamentary exchanges. I'm sure some of you know it. Gladstone and Disraeli were always at each other's very top parts anyway. And you remember there's a classic description of Disraeli of Gladstone where he referred to him as a sophistical rhetorician, inebriated by the exuberance of his own verbosity, who can at all times command an interminable series of arguments to malign an opponent or to justify himself. That's the kind of elegance you don't get these days, certainly not on the Twitter feeds of certain illustrious people. And you can even drop down to Winston Churchill, who had, I thought, a rather zealous and praiseworthy nasty side. And he referred to Mr. Attlee, as I'm sure you know, as a very modest little man with much to be modest about. And on another occasion said that being under fire from Clement Attlee was like being savaged by a dead sheep. We don't get these pearls. I got one slightly vulgar one, and I hesitate because it is slightly vulgar. I am so antique that I don't like using even the trivial vulgar, but this one can't survive without the vulgarism. You don't think of Lyndon Johnson normally as Oscar Wilde in any capacity, but at one point he described Gerald Ford as being so stupid that he couldn't pour piss out of a cowboy boot if the instructions were written on the heel. My last one, and this will cause shock within the room and probably get me ejected, but it's not my language. It's the Earl of Sandwich, but I'm going to ascribe it to Disraeli, just because it makes it easier to talk about. They had a great clash in Parliament. This is the last one. I'm going to get to the real people. This is the last one. They had the big clash. Gladstone, as usual, in that context, lost. And he emerged into the lobby of the great British House of Commons, fuming with rage, smoke coming out of his various orifices, and went under the chin of Disraeli, looking up at him and saying, "My friend, you will die either on the gallows or of some horrible disease." To which Disraeli replied, "That depends, my friend, on whether I embrace your policies or your mistress." Told you it was savage. Anyway, I know nothing in terms of the science that's engaged in this particular proposition. As I say, my function here is to be a neuter and an anticlimax, and merely to do two things, I believe. and that is to keep a reasonable eye on the time limits that are extended. They're generous, 10 minutes per speaker in the first round. We're a very easy audience here, and I'm especially easy today because not long ago I was in Newfoundland, and to come from Newfoundland to Saskatoon is, I feel I'm in Tahiti or something. And if anyone here has a hula dress, I'll be glad to put it on. So I'm in a very forgiving mood, so you don't have to kill the sentence before you get to the predicate, 30 seconds more or less to wind the thought down, but not beyond that. And then there will be the intermission, then the rebuttal, and 5 minutes per each speaker. So there's really not much more, I don't think, unless now, Morris, have I skipped many things and made balls of it already? Everything is okay?
Everybody should have voted by now. We've taken down the website, but we'll put it up again at the end of the debate so people can re-vote.
Okay. Well, and then I call upon our first speaker, Dr. Hannah Tumistu, please.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, thank you very much. And so I'm speaking for the statement that agriculture and forestry hold the best hope for humanity to mitigate atmospheric CO2 and climate change. And now I assume that everybody knows what climate change is and why we need to mitigate CO2. And so my first statement is that it's actually already happening. So this is already partly done, because if we look at the historic CO2 emissions, the emissions are actually increasing much more than the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. And that's a lot to do with the greening effect. So basically, the forests and agriculture land and all other vegetation is actually growing faster and capturing already much more carbon from the atmosphere. But of course, we can do much more. And basically, the first thing that we could do is, or the most effective way, is to grow more forests everywhere where we can, and also avoid reforestation. Okay, there may be one argument that the opposing party is going to say is the albedo effect. So in the north, in some areas, it might be actually better not to grow forest, because if there is ice and snow, it reflects more heat away, and so then it's not a good idea to convert that land area for forest, because it's darker, and then this darker surface absorbs more heat, and the total effect is a net warming effect. But in otherwise, we have lots of areas in Asia and especially in Brazil where we could grow trees back, and also avoid further conversion of forest to agriculture land. And then, of course, breeding like new species of trees so that we could have faster growing trees, and then also using this wood for buildings and all sorts of materials. So basically, when we build a house from using wood, then that's kind of like quite a long carbon stock that is stored in that building. And in the forest where the wood was taken from, new trees will grow, and then that's a net carbon sequestration effect. And now, of course, this hot term, bioeconomy, which is everywhere. So basically, we should make everything from renewable materials, wood and plants, and so basically then we would store more carbon, at least in short term, in all materials that we use. And then one of the most important things where we should start this conversion of land to forest, it is all peat lands, because from those lands there are really high CO2 emissions, especially if we use peatlands for agriculture, like in Finland. Okay, it's a small country and very, very small contribution to the total greenhouse gas emissions in the world, but 50% of our greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture come from these peatlands that are used for agriculture. So the first thing how we could, in Finland, we could cut 50% of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture would be to convert those lands to permanent pastures or forests. And then what we can do in agriculture. So basically, in many places we have heard that no-till would be the option, and conservation agriculture, reduced tillage, where we don't use plowing at all. But there is a little bit controversial science behind that, because it looks like that no-till always doesn't have net carbon reduction, especially if we take into account the nitrous oxide emissions that may be increased from no-till systems. And then also regarding the carbon storage in the soil, there is evidence that it's mainly stored, or the increase in the carbon in the soil is happening in the top layer of the soil, but not on the lower layers. And then there may be also a little bit like a transition between the carbon from the lower layers to the top layers, so there is not actually net carbon sequestration happening. But then there is a little bit conflicting results from different regions in the world. So in some areas it can actually have net carbon sequestration as well. But there are many other ways how we could increase carbon storage in the soils in agriculture, and also how we could reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. And so one of the important ways is to use deep-rooted crops. So legume crops and also clover has really deep roots, and when the crop is harvested, the roots will stay in the soil, and they will increase the carbon storage in the soil. And then we could also, so generally cereals, maize and wheat, they have very small roots, and so one option could be to breed new crops that have also cereal crops that have really deep roots. And then also adding organic matter inputs into the soil, so leaving straw in there, using cover crops, and then maybe using biochar, which is we could make biochar by a pyrolysis process. So it's basically high temperature that produces char from, for example, wood, and then also gas and oil that can be used for energy and other purposes. And this, if we put this char into the soil, there is some evidence that it can actually stay there for really long time, so much longer than from other organic inputs. And then we can improve the manure management systems and grazing, optimize the grazing so that the carbon storage in the soils is increased. And then also breed higher yielding crops, improve the nutrient use efficiency and water use efficiency, that we get more yield from a land area, which would also help us to save more land for forests. And also if we would reduce the consumption of livestock products and maybe develop these new technologies for producing food, vertical farming, and the cellular agriculture processes that I presented earlier, then those would save even much more land from agriculture to forests and carbon mitigation.
30 seconds.
30, okay. So I'm almost dead. So then how can we make this all happen so that it's economically possible? So Stuart will talk more about that, but also if we could implement payments for ecosystem services, because all of these practices, they have also many other benefits for ecosystems like biodiversity, water filtration, flood control, and soil improvements. So in that way, we could also make these economically feasible.
Thank you very much. Oh, it's changing again. Well, thank you very much, Doctor. And now I will call upon Professor Richard Flavell. Please, sir, the microphone is yours.
Thank you. So, good afternoon. You're an astute audience, and so you certainly don't want to make conclusions based on sound bites, dumbed downs, or scientific bits of poorly selected information. You want the real story. Well, science tells us that managing greenhouse gas accounting is very complex, and we certainly cannot rely on land managers in their millions all over the world to solve the problem. That's socially and economically naive, and knowing the world as it really is, you'll certainly vote against this motion. We all know that global warming and CO2 increases have been happening for 100 years and more, but all that time agriculture has become increasingly intense. Now that fact alone tells you that agriculture is not the solution. It has not mitigated global warming. In fact, all the studies show that agriculture is the problem, not the solution. Consequently, continuation of agriculture as we know it, in all its diverse forms, cannot achieve the proposition in this debate, even recognizing all the new knowledge that's been gained in the past few decades. We'd have to look at a different agriculture and forestry, one that is greenhouse neutral or negative. But creating such a radical change against the background of managing climate change itself and the need for every one of the millions of farmers to make a living, for the growing world population to be fed, for pests and diseases to be managed, world trade to be sustained, right subsidies to be sorted out, political preferences to be justified, all that looks truly a hopeless dream. It seems an unattainable challenge to rely on a radically different agriculture to achieve mitigation of greenhouse gas accumulation. You will certainly agree. The changes have to transcend space and time, not one field, one environment, one crop, one continent, 1 year, 1 decade, but you have to see the system as a whole, globally, over many decades. Carbon can take decades to accumulate, but be lost from soils in a day. Greenhouse gases are not national. Wherever they accumulate or are lost, affects the planet. Let's take for a moment a deeper look into what agriculture does to affect greenhouse gas levels. Yes, plants take CO2 out of the atmosphere in photosynthesis, but only in the growing seasons, and not during the night when there's no sunlight. The rest of the time, ag systems release greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Yes, the more CO2 that's accumulated in the atmosphere has led to greater fixation rates of carbon some of the time, but it's the complexity behind the biology of photosynthesis that we need to factor in. You see, photosynthesis is driven by nitrogen. A plant is full of the Ribisco enzyme complex to carry out photosynthesis, but that's a protein and it's built from nitrogen. Massive innovations have occurred, as we know, to create plants with more photosynthesis, high yields, more profit, but this requires more nitrogen fertilizer. but that takes fossil fuel energy to produce. And so there's a trade-off in greenhouse gas accounting. Adding more nitrogen to soils to fix more carbon also creates larger emissions of nitrous oxide and methane, because there's lots of bacteria in the soil nitrifying and denitrifying. And here's another trade-off for greenhouse gas statistics. Similarly, there are trade-off statistics of the energy used to make and spray herbicides and fungicides. Plants are very sophisticated organisms. The regulation of photosynthesis is exquisite. And if there's not much nitrogen, photosynthesis stops. If there's not much water, photosynthesis stops. When there's no outlet for the fixed carbon and too much is accumulated, the plant respires it and turns the CO back into the atmosphere. If there's too much sugar, the product accumulated, then photosynthesis shuts down. Photosynthesis gets inhibited by higher temperatures, and what does global warming do? In certain places, it highes the temperatures. So you see, plants are self-regulating, and there are many trade-offs being generated in real time. So just because you've got more CO2 in the atmosphere doesn't say that you get an equivalent response of carbon being taken out by photosynthesis. So given all these features of plants and many more that I could say if I had 10 days instead of 10 minutes, and the trade-offs in agriculture and forestry, why would we ever begin to think that agriculture and forestry are a solution to mitigate greenhouse gas accumulation? You're for sure going to vote against this, I can see it. So for agriculture and forestry to lead to any kind of solution to rising CO2 levels, these processes clearly have to be globally very different from now, while continuing, of course, to feed the world with food, feed, and fiber. So how can they be different? What mitigation strategies can be adopted? Well, many are known a theory. The scientific journals are full of them. Some of them are actually practiced in some places. No-till agriculture, adding less fertilizers, using slow-release fertilizers, using nitrification inhibitors. But all these do take up energy to be made and applied. Managing water supplies would also help. Avoiding waste, as we heard yesterday, could contribute. We can imagine that precision ag systems, where expensive machines are monitoring potential greenhouse gas economics as fields are being planted, managed, and harvested, would be great. Clearly, creating plants that do not have these feedback checks on photosynthesis, so they continue to take a lot more carbon out of the atmosphere than plants currently, would be great. Plants that have much better nitrogen utilization efficiencies would be great. And there's super exciting work on all these features that's filling the journals. And I have no doubt that they will be achieved. But it will take a long, long time. You know, if it's a great idea in this conference, then it's probably going to take maybe 20 years to get it reduced to practice, taken up by the first farmers, and probably to be taken up by the farmers at scale, it's going to take, well, it's in decades, and quite honestly, we don't have that time. So there's lots that could be done, but they all have trade-offs. And so without doing full accounting of greenhouse gas situations, you can come to naive conclusions, the sort that this audience would never make, and that's why you're going to vote against the proposition. The timescales are really, really important. I've said that no matter how much innovation takes place, it takes a long time to get these things to be adopted. But in addition to those kinds of adoptions, you know, will the governments ever get the right laws in place rapidly enough around the world? Will industries change fast enough around the world? Will people vote for changes in their lifestyles fast enough? No, 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 I say, on a global scale. Very importantly, can farmers be expected to find and manage fast enough the sweet spots in these trade-offs between adapting to climate change on the one hand, keeping the emissions down, on the other, conserving carbon in soils, both for soil sustainability and greenhouse gas mitigation? This is a very big thing to ask millions of farmers to do. Come on. This is not a paper in an academic journal. This is facing reality. I think just even sorting out the quotas that farmers would need to address is a tall order. So while all this complexity is being managed, greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture are continuing to pile up and not really being mitigated. Now, as an academic, I get what is possible in theory, and that's the problem. The real world is different. Getting all these diverse innovation trade-offs right in all the places across the globe to make agriculture and forestry the solution for mitigating climate change is a pipe dream. Too much change is required, too much innovation required in too short a time. So, believe you me, you will be being biologically naive, politically naive, and failing to bring others to a proper understanding of potential solutions if you vote in favor of this motion. But don't lose hope and optimism, because changes in agriculture can play their part, but it will take a lot more than agriculture and forestry to bring greenhouse gas accumulation into line. Vote against the motion.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much. Am I all right to call you this time?
Yes, I'll come this time.
Dr. Stuart Smythe, sir.
Thank you, Rex.
Have you finished voting?
So in your introduction, I was reminded of a great line by Mark Twain when he said, "While I didn't attend the funeral, I sent a letter wholeheartedly endorsing it." So thank you to Morris and GIFS for the invitation this afternoon. And while my esteemed colleague would appear to have just finished reading A Bleak Midsummer's Night, I'm here to give you the, no one likes ants at a picnic, and like a debate, there's nothing like a few facts to clarify what really is going on. So we've just finished working on an assessment of how greenhouse gas emissions and sequestration has functioned within the province of Saskatchewan. To be compliant with the Paris Accord, Saskatchewan would have to reduce emissions by about 20 megatons. And just through forestry alone, we're at 52%. Agriculture is pretty much a wash when we work in the applications of fertilizer, nitrogen-based fertilizers. So it's been a marginal sink for the last 4 years in our province, given that we've transitioned from so much weed tillage intensive agriculture to zero and minimum tillage land management systems. We've removed about 12 million acres of summer fallow just in Saskatchewan over the last 20 years. So that's a substantial advancement to a more sustainable and also a technology that helps sequester greenhouse gas emissions on an annual basis. So with crop agriculture being sort of a neutral on this one, really forestry is where the advantage is going to be. I was fortunate enough to be at an event last fall and was talking to a group of smaller group of environmentalists sort of about where are some of the options, or where can innovation happen within agriculture and forestry to really make a substantial difference. So if we take the forestry we've got in northern Saskatchewan, which is accounting now for 52% of the reduction in Saskatchewan's emissions, and I said to them, what would happen if we came up with genetically modified trees? So there's research that's going on right now. There's a couple of papers that came out in 2016 that show in laboratory research they've been able to create plants that can increase their ability to sequester carbon by 20%. I was talking to the president of Metabolics a little over a year ago, and he said they had a variety of corn that they found in field trials was reducing or increasing its carbon sequestration by 35 to 40%. So I said to this small group of environmental organization, I said, what could happen to your perspectives about biotechnology, genetic modification, and greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, if we could come up with trees that could increase carbon sequestration by, let's say, 35%, 1/3. And there was kind of silence while I walked through this idea to the room. And then talking to them afterwards, they said, this is an absolute game changer. Said, we typically have been opposed to GM crops and to biotechnology, but if we could go out and we could plant a tree in our backyard and know that that tree is going to be increasing carbon sequestration for the next 50, 80 years, depending on where you live, that is a real game changer. It allows us to take an entirely new perspective on how we look at innovation within agriculture. So the fact that we have proven technology already in laboratory and field trial use of plants being able to increase their ability to sequester carbon by anywhere from 20 to 40%. We've got forestry in Saskatchewan right now that's doing 50% at the level it's able to sequester. Richard talked about how we don't have decades. That's right. If we could modify trees within the next 8 to 10 years and start introducing those as saplings into replanting forests, certainly in Canada, but most of the northern climates, that would give us a real leg up in a lot of countries. So instead of talking about 50% just through forestry, if we were able to increase that by, say, 1/3, we'd be now talking that 70%, 75% of the requirement GHG reductions could simply be achieved through the proper forest management. So I think that really opens up, it gives us a really new perspective on how science can contribute to looking at greenhouse gas mitigation and climate change strategies. So I would suggest that we're not looking at a bleak midsummer's night. We're looking at a very positive, a very exuberant, almost a parade or a carnival-like approach to looking at the next few years around climate change and really how there's a tremendous opportunity if we look at removing some of the barriers to innovation. Right now it takes 3 to 4 years in some countries to get approval for a genetically modified plant, if it can be approved at all. Europe simply will not approve any of these for planting. But how would that change within a European perspective if now they could put it into a forestry situation? It's not something that's going to be directly consumed. The product of that's not going to be directly consumable. Put it into your hardwoods and your timbers. So I think it opens up a real opportunity to look at where the barriers to this type of innovation might exist and how can science help look at some of these barriers, identify some of the costs of these barriers, and try to get them out of the way so that enables or frees up science to move at a faster pace. Richard's right. We don't have 20 or 30 years to sit around and figure out how to manage these things. We need to fast track some of these innovations. Genetically modified crops have been grown globally for 25 years now. There hasn't been environmental issues around them. So instead of requiring 8 or 10 years worth of research and 3 or 4 years of field trials, what if we fast-track this technology? It's already proven in existence. We just need to start putting it into forestry products, and in 3 to 5 years, we could have these trees in nurseries, and by the end of the decade, rolling out into forestries around the world. So I think that innovation in science, in forestry, the forestry aspect of agriculture, offers a fantastic solution, a fantastic opportunity to really change the perspective. And I'm really hopeful that a little bit of optimism will drive home the fact that we're on the right side of this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. Dr. Merritt, is it you next?
It is.
Please.
Thank you for all sticking in. So I want to begin with something we can all agree on. we have a carbon problem. But our problem is actually black carbon. So we're taking fossil fuel carbon or black carbon out of the ground and we're emitting it to the atmosphere, and this is causing global warming. So there are a variety of other kinds of carbon. There's blue carbon, coastal carbon, or wetland carbon. There's green carbon, and this is what we're talking about today, biological carbon on land. Now, green carbon seems like one of the cheaper and more feel-good ways to solve climate change. Green carbon is often described as a win-win. Win-win scenarios are appealing. So green carbon is often viewed as being good for soil fertility, right? Sequestering more carbon in our soils, great for soil fertility. It's also going to save our climate. Everybody loves soils, right? So how could we not embrace green carbon? But it's not a win-win. It's a win-wish. A win for agriculture and a wish for climate. Or even worse, it's a win, hope it's all going to work out. And that's really dangerous. So I'm going to argue today that green carbon needs to be viewed very cautiously for 3 reasons. First, green carbon is distracting us from our real problem, our black carbon problem. Biological mitigation will not allow us to bypass any of the hard work in reducing our emissions. The only real way to deal with our carbon problem is to not emit that carbon in the first place. Now, this is not going to be easy, and decarbonization is one of our great challenges, perhaps our greatest challenge. But consider headlines like this: sucking carbon out of the air will solve climate change. Or, farming out global warming solutions, buying time to develop alternative technologies. When people read headlines like this, it's a distraction from the real problem. We have a carbon problem, and anything that diverts our attention from this is actually making the situation worse. We need to do whatever we can to reduce our emissions, these kinds of emissions. The second reason that biological mitigation is risky is that we can't guarantee its permanence. Biological stocks of carbon, particularly on land, will always be subject to reversals. Increased wildfire, pest and insects, drought. We have no control over these disturbances, and they're increasing with warming. In some of my own studies, I've measured how wildfires can combust and release hundreds of years of accumulation in a matter of mere minutes. This puts any reforestation project at risk. Fire and insect outbreaks have already converted Canada's managed forests from net sinks to net carbon sources. So I think it would be really unwise to think that we have the management tools to minimize those risks. We don't. And this applies to below-ground carbon as well, which will always be subject to reversal during drought. So biological mitigation is dangerous because of non-permanence, or this risk of reversal. It's also a stark reminder of the difference between this and this. These are not the same things, not the same kinds of carbon. The third reason we need to be cautious about green carbon is that these strategies are often not practical. The Rothamsted and other long-term experiments show that soil carbon saturates over time. Soils simply don't keep accumulating carbon more and more forever. And this is why soils cannot solve climate change. And there are trade-offs with other ecosystem services, trade-offs with nutrients. Large applications of manure or compost certainly can increase soil organic matter, but they often lead to increased phosphorus and nitrate runoff. Where I live near the Great Lakes and the Lake Erie watershed, this is unacceptable. Trade-offs with food. Removing marginal land and converting it to wetland or prairie worked in the Rothamsted experiment to achieve climate stabilization. But adopting these practices would have pretty big impacts on global food production. There are also practical challenges for farmers. Despite climate benefits, farmers today are growing fewer and fewer perennials. And one reason is because there are so few cash crop perennial options. And this is why biofuels are really appealing, at least second-generation biofuels. But to achieve meaningful climate benefits, a huge land area would need to be used, including converting agricultural land to biofuels. We are simply running out of land. Only about 10% of the ice-free land surface remains available for human management of biomass. We need some of that land to feed 9 billion. We need some of it for urban development. We need space for reforestation projects. There is simply not enough land to accommodate everything. And for this reason, green carbon projects are often at odds with each other, competing for this very same limited land base. So green carbon is simply not that practical. We need to feed a growing world, and we're running out of space. So I've provided 3 arguments for why green carbon needs to be viewed cautiously. It's a distraction, it's non-permanent, and it's not practical. It's also simply not backed up by evidence. So most studies agree that with current technology, the potential for land mitigation certainly is there, and Hannah showed us some evidence of that in her talk today. But the potential is relatively small when compared to the overall requirements needed for climate stabilization, only providing about 5 or 6% of the total mitigation we need. So there's a lot of emerging technologies. For example, algal-based biofuels that take pressure off of land. But we can't rely on theoretical solutions. We don't have time. Arguing that green carbon is our best opportunity for climate change mitigation is like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. I want to talk about 2 really important but unconventional agricultural issues that loom very large on the global carbon stage. Only a few decades ago, tropical peatlands started to be drained, mostly for palm oil and acacia. Today, more than 20% of Malaysian peatlands have been drained and cultivated. It is not an exaggeration to say that this has been a carbon disaster. In their pristine state, tropical peatlands are resistant to fire until they're drained. In 2015, fires on cleared tropical peatlands produced more emissions than did the whole of Europe. During extreme fire years, these carbon emissions approach global fossil fuel emissions. This issue is not often identified as an agricultural carbon problem, but it is. So let's return home. With warming, many climate models show that a northern expansion of crops. Will boreal and Arctic soils be our next agricultural hotspot? A lot of people think so. And this could be a solution to the really high food prices that have plagued the North for a while. So this is great news, emerging opportunities with climate change. But northern soils store twice as much carbon as is contained in the entire atmosphere, way more than tropical soils. So what's going to happen to that soil carbon if we drain and cultivate northern soils? We don't have best management practices, not yet. Add Canadian wildfires to this mix, and we have another recipe for a carbon disaster. Most green carbon studies do not include horizon scans with these emerging issues. And from a carbon perspective, the horizon is not all pretty. Let me conclude. I do think we have a bright future ahead with a lot of ways to reduce agricultural emissions and improve biofuels. But we have a long ways to go before we can reduce those emissions to deal with this problem. There is no silver bullet. We need a big, diverse carbon toolbox. We need a rainbow of carbon colors, a portfolio of solutions that we can deploy when and where it makes sense. But until our black carbon problem is taken care of, our most important goal is emissions reductions. And it's going to take effort from all of us with strong policy. There's no technology that can be used to meet the 2-degree centigrade warming target without significant impacts on energy, food, water, or cost. So there is no plan B. We only have plan A. And that plan needs to be based on reducing reliance on fossil fuels. Plan A needs to take a food-first approach, and it needs to avoid deforestation at all cost. Of course, we should enhance soil organic matter where it makes sense and where it benefits soil fertility. But to use it as a mitigation strategy is impractical at best and misleading at worst. We cannot fall into the win-wish trap. Diverting our attention from black carbon is deepening our carbon problem. But if we stay focused on the real issue, the black carbon issue, I think we still have hope, and we can do this.
We're going to give the debaters a little interlude before they come back for the rebuttal, and that interlude will consist of an opportunity, say, for the next 15 minutes or so, for you to join in the discussion that's been inaugurated and stimulated so far by the four up here. And you can either direct comment or question or argument to any one of the panelists, or just make, as I said, general observation on the turn of arguments so far. So anybody who wishes to start this off? Pardon? Oh, go right ahead, please.
Neither team has addressed the elephant in the room, and that is that there are too many people on this planet. The one-child policy in China hasn't worked. So my solution is that it is a requirement from now on out that males should be sterilized.
I have heard that before.
Jennifer, that's fantastic.
Outside. Who wants to take that on? Or is it, no one considers it redundant? No. Okay, we've had the first serious contribution. Anyone got a light question to pursue here? On any of the elements of the argument so far? I'm sorry, I can't see with the light. Go ahead.
I noted that neither side of the debate here mentioned the fact that we have an enormous amount of fossil fuel, coal, oil, gas. We have incredible amounts of limestone. All that carbon has been fixed. When plants first evolved, the carbon dioxide concentration of the atmosphere was 5%. It is now less than 0.5%. So all of that carbon was sequestered. So if plants did it in the past, why can't they do it again?
I'll take that on if that's okay. So there's been quite a lot of carbon sequestration in soils. So it starts in plants and it works its way down. And this is indeed what I touched on with the massive amounts of carbon stored in our soils. These are mostly lying in permafrost soils. So we used to think that there was a strong biological lock on soil organic matter, that litter quality, soil quality, chemistry mattered. We now know that it's the physical processes, temperature, moisture, physical aggradation in the soils that really drive carbon cycle. And so permafrost carbon pools, which is the most significant active reservoir, so it's not buried in the deep ocean, it's still relatively near the surface. That's Pleistocene carbon, and it's been locked in soil because of cold temperatures and in some cases waterlogged temperatures. When we remove those physical constraints, much of that carbon will become available again for re-release. So just to put in your head that some of that carbon got preserved because of those physical constraints on microbial communities.
Basically I addressed this issue already at the beginning of my talk, that the vegetation is being more so the forests are capturing this carbon. So we are already, or the nature has already done this mitigation for us. So that's why wouldn't we utilize that in the future as well? But of course we have all of these additional challenges, so more carbon releasing from different sources, also from biological sources. So
my family's been farming for hundreds, if not thousands of years on more than one continent. And I'm sort of down to the end of my peoples due to a variety of things. And what I have done is I've switched the land that was broken here within the last 100 years back to organics. And I used the Fukuoka method of Japanese agriculture to find the allopathic plant. And that turns out to be yellow clover, which is a deep-rooted plant which goes into a deep sequestration, and I've got a organic coal field below that in the area that I'm in. I'm at the edge of the Grasslands National Park, and where we missed the last ice age. So I'm doing everything that's possible with what I've got and using the powers of Mother Nature and all that, but I have a real problem. with the new comprehensive economic trade agreement, which still hasn't told me what I can do, and the canceling of the marketing systems in Canada with the wheat board and other things, I still get a yearly tax bill. And my yearly tax bill has to be paid. And with the way things are going with my clover crop and stuff, the local farmers are reluctant to use it because they're not sure if it'll feed their system. I grew up with clover and it worked just fine up to a point. So what I would like to know is how do I manage to pay my taxes or make available what I've done to some more enlightened generation and more intelligent folks like the people that are here and are paying attention to your conference, because I'm getting too old. I turned 65 the other day, and I'm trying to figure out how to make a living on my $200 a month pension. So we need to turn the economics around. Either I get some people to help me and continue on and move through this process, because people keep peopling, or I just crawl in the graveyard at the top of the hill and somebody will snag it and nothing will be done because they'll knock it down because they know that I haven't made any money for the last decade. So I don't know what to do.
Yeah, so that's basically also an issue that I addressed a little bit. So we should implement the payments for ecosystem services, because now those things are not recognized at all. And also, like the opposing party was saying that the governments are too slow to do anything, but we don't necessarily need to wait for the governments to do it, because the private sector can do it. And also, like offsetting carbon when we consume something or fly, or why wouldn't the private sector use this as a marketing way that we have offset the carbon from our products, so then that money could be used for growing more trees or paying for farmers who actually increase the carbon storage in the soils. So all of this can happen, and then if we could also implement some kind of payments for other ecosystem services like biodiversity and water filtration and also reducing nutrient losses to the waterways and things like that. So then it would be more profitable to use these kind of farming practices that are good for the environment.
You want to say something? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I can't address the issue of taxation in Canada, but this is a good example of what I'm trying to draw attention to. Across the globe, there are millions and millions of local difficulties as well as opportunities. And so where we have on this planet a problem that can only be overcome by scale, we're up against great difficulties. Whether you've got a brilliant success by one farmer in managing one farm, and it's a great paper in a journal or a great piece in the newspaper, that says absolutely nothing about the ability to address this issue, because the answer has to come through scale, which means people agreeing on taxation systems, carbon tax, the underlying systems. And my side of the argument is I don't see that happening in the time scale that we've got available.
Okay, I just want to say something in order to clarify something so that everybody here will not underestimate the potential effect of agriculture as a strategy to mitigate the emission of carbon dioxide, because I find the idea of Dr. Turitsky is a bit distract us from the real thing, because yes, of course, the burning of fossil fuels actually emitted a lot of carbon dioxide, and we need a way to mitigate the emission from this part, but that doesn't necessarily mean agriculture is not useful to mitigate carbon dioxide, because many studies have shown us agriculture-related emissions or the emissions that connected to the activity of crop production has actually accounts for about maybe 10 to 25% of the total global greenhouse gas emissions. So that means agriculture-related emissions is quite important. That it plays an important role in the carbon dioxide. Therefore, I think mitigate the greenhouse emissions from agriculture can be a very useful way to mitigate climate change, because many studies also show the carbon dioxide or soil organic carbon sequestration in the soil can be a very useful way to mitigate the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, and this can also be a useful way to improve the soil fertility. Thus, we can apply less synthetic nitrogen, which means less nitrous oxide will be emitted to the atmosphere. And I think because this is really useful, that's why after the Paris climate agreement, I think that's the name, people announced a plan called 4 per 1,000. This means to increase the soil organic carbon sequestration by 4 per 1,000 every year to mitigate the greenhouse gas emissions from this.
Well, since you addressed that to me, maybe I can take a stab. So I agree with some points in your comment. I really appreciate it. So let me just clarify a little bit. So agriculture today is the second largest source of greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere. Fossil fuels, agriculture, land use conversion.
Have you got that?
Now, I'm an optimist, so hold on. Some of that greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture is black carbon, old carbon, fossil fuel carbon, and some of it is what we call modern carbon, recently absorbed from the atmosphere and cycled right back. So by reducing agricultural carbon emissions, we're not necessarily mitigating fossil fuel carbon. It is really important to find efficiencies in the agricultural system. It's the second largest source of greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere. We've got a big problem if we can't tighten up that budget. It does not mitigate fossil fuel carbon.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so second point, real quick. You mentioned the COP21 goal of 4 per 1,000.
Yeah.
Fantastic goal. I love soils. I am the queen of peat on Twitter, so I love soil carbon. It has not been met. It cannot be met. It's conclusively not met. Some places we can achieve those levels, but it takes an extraordinary amount of effort to meet those levels of soil organic matter. They cannot be sustained. Everyone involved in that, setting that sustainability goal has now agreed with that.
Yeah, I just would like to mention that from agriculture, actually, the major greenhouse gas emissions are nitrous oxide and methane, so they are not really CO2. And so nitrous oxide emissions come from the use of nitrogen fertilizers, so from the soil, and there are many ways how we can reduce those emissions by improving the nitrogen use efficiency and also using these nitrification inhibitors and things like that. And then also methane emissions are mainly from livestock production. So then, and especially from ruminant production like beef and lamb. So then if we could reduce the consumption of livestock products and especially red meat that would also have health benefits, then we could reduce these emissions from agriculture and also release more land outside from agriculture for carbon mitigation purposes.
We'll go with 3 more. I'll start here and then we'll come back. Go ahead. Okay.
Aloha. Welcome to Saskatoon. Thanks for stirring this room and everybody here with and beyond with these earthy topics. This question is kind of regarding the internal landscape that may correlate with all this kind of externalization of being, where overarching concepts such as consumerism, capitalism, and that correlation with, say, body health and things like parasitism and these different health effects that can infiltrate the body in the same way that an ideology could potentially infiltrate a world. So maybe just as a show of hands, how many people in here have gone through currently or periodically purge parasitic organisms?
We're not doing a survey from a question.
Okay.
Something on the topic, and then we'll move to another one.
So that's just possibly an example of this kind of response to these kinds of questions. And essentially, the question is what everybody may feel about this kind of correlating, or how this could potentially have an effect on the value of, say, eating less sugar, which is a carbon-based molecule, and perhaps planting more trees.
Anyone wish to follow?
That was so profound, I have no answer.
Actually,
Okay, we'll take, there are 2 more, then we will come back to the debate.
Okay, I hope this is ever so slightly outside the question, and I really don't want Rex to chastise me, so I hope this is okay. Dr. Turetsky, I really, really liked your points, and I thought that you spoke to all of the values that I already had. So my question to you, though, is do you have a feeling for how we can start to mitigate our emissions through policy? I'm thinking particularly in Australia, 5 years ago, we tried to introduce a carbon tax and 2 prime ministers were removed over this huge debate. The coal and oil industries have this huge stranglehold over our politicians. Do you have any thoughts for how we can start to move forward with that?
Oh, I do. I mean, I am a scientist and a researcher, but of course I research carbon, and so I think about policies. And we had this agreement that you would play bad cop and I would play good cop. There's a lot of potential through legislation, but the key is we're not going to get that legislation and that policy until we all push for it. So it needs to be a grassroots effort that filters right up to our politicians. And so if things get pricier, because we value climate, and maybe this is what you were touching on in terms of our kind of value system of the whole planet, we have to be willing to absorb that as individuals and push for it in our politicians. And until that happens, we are not going to be moving forward at the pace we need to. And I'll talk a little bit more about solutions in the next round as well.
Okay, we have 2 more, is it?
Just as a counter to that, lots of the public acceptance research shows that the public is very concerned about the environment and policies around the environment when the economy is strong, when they've got no worries about the future of their job. As soon as the economy turns and starts going towards a recession, the public support for the environment drops substantially. So that's why you would have seen politicians getting turfed over putting taxes on carbon in place. So the challenge becomes is how do you remove government from being the solution to, and allowing, as Hannah said, allowing the private market to step in and do the job economically and efficiently and long term, rather than having government and political will try to deal with this in a 4-year political cycle.
Okay, we got 2 left. We'll go 1 and 1, and that will be it, and we come back to the rebuttal.
Actually, my question is an extension of that one, and you said you might want to address it later. I was just wondering, because you mentioned that our #1 priority should be focusing on decreasing the black carbon emissions. I was wondering if you could provide specific examples. If you're running the show, how would you do that? The policies you would put into place, how do you see that?
I'll talk a little bit about this in my concluding remarks, and then I am sure we can have a very lengthy and fun discussion at the gala dinner. But for sure, I talked about a portfolio of solutions. I think agriculture and biofuels are part of that portfolio. They're actually a pretty small part of that portfolio if you even consider ideal kind of improvements into the future. So unless real changing emerging technologies develop, we need a very, very diverse toolbox.
Last one.
If possible, I'd like you to address the scale issue. Saskatchewan is loaded with incredible innovators, but there's only 1/10,000th of the total globe's population in Saskatchewan, and while you have 0.5% of the globe's land area. So what you can do in Saskatchewan proportionally is not representative of what we can do globally. So, because you got to make up for 50 times more than what your population is here.
That's true, yes. So I think there's a unique opportunity to really look at, because we also hold 40% of the production agriculture. So if we have plants that can sequester carbon at a larger rate or a more efficient level, then that gives Canada a step forward where we now have 40% of plant agriculture in this province contributing, instead of being a marginal contributor, that could step up so that it is a natural sink that spills over into the rest of Canada. If we had our forestry and plant agriculture components sequestering carbon at a 35 or 40% level, I'm very confident that we could certainly manage this. And the other aspect that I'd like to just mention is that through 20 years of continuous cropping and zero tillage, farmers are reporting that they're adding soil depth. So we lost a lot of soil in the 30s and in the early 80s. I grew up on a farm and watched a lot of our topsoil blow into Manitoba. So if we're adding soil depth, this is not a capstone issue that, you can argue that, well, soil can only sequester carbon for a certain period of time, but if farmers are reporting that they're adding, in some cases they're talking 3 to 6 inches over the last 20 years have been added back to their fields. This is an ongoing advantage that we continually increase our soil depth so that we don't run into this carbon cap problem that could be something the opponents would suggest is a problem.
Okay, then we return to call it the crisis of the debate, when each side selects their champion to give both summary and rebuttal. And from here, Stuart, Hannah, which is it?
Okay, let's start.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's over to you.
No, yeah.
Okay, so yeah, agriculture and forestry will definitely be the answer to mitigate climate change. Of course, we need to reduce the use of fossil fuels as well, but on the other hand, that can only reduce the emissions, but it cannot take the carbon out from the atmosphere. So we need really to take a lot of the carbon that is already there out from there and mitigate it in the soils and in the vegetations. And we should not wait for the governments to do it, because the private sector will do it. So if you ask people, they are all interested in environment and the future, and this concept of planetary health is becoming more common. So understanding that the environmental issues are not something that happens somewhere outside of us, but they are actually our health problems. So we have to take them seriously if we want to care about our children and grandchildren. And so basically, we all want farmers want to do it. consumers are interested in paying maybe more for it, and if consumers are not willing to pay more for carbon sequestration, then companies will do it automatically. So basically, food industry, they are interested in the responsibility issues, so they will actually already include this carbon offsetting payment in the prices of the products. So then the consumers will just buy the food that they like to eat, and at the same time they actually already offset the carbon, because there is a small additional amount that will be used for growing trees or paying farmers to use farming practices that mitigate carbon. And also additional payments will come through these ecosystem services. So we wouldn't think only about carbon, but also other ecosystem services. And then, on the other hand, the farmers want to do it automatically, because they can see that if they don't take care of the soil and add more organic matter into the soil and carbon, then the yields start to suffer in the future, because there are more extreme climatic events, drought and heavy rains. So only by taking care of the soil, and where the soil carbon is really an important issue, that's the only way of keeping the productivity of the soil also in the future high. And then regarding how we could grow more forests, that's all to do with the bioeconomy. So there will be more demand for wood, and we will use it everywhere. So then we have also more incentives to grow forest wherever it's possible. And then at the same time, we are developing new technologies for producing food and other materials and also fuels. And these kind of new technologies, like the vertical farming and cellular agriculture, will release huge areas of land for carbon mitigation. And then still people can continue eating the same foods that they are used to eating. So everybody doesn't even need to change for vegetarians. So basically, we have huge potential in the agriculture and forestry sector to mitigate the climate change, and we should use it and start now acting towards this goal. Thank you.
Go ahead.
So green carbon is important, absolutely, but we're talking about less than 5% of the total mitigation we need to achieve the less than 2 degrees centigrade warming target. For every year that we delay reaching peak emissions, the harder and riskier it's going to be to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So I am an optimist, but make no mistake, things are really serious and they're urgent. Our real challenge is the epic scale of this problem. We have carbon emissions at global scales, energy demands that emerge at global scales. We have hundreds of solutions that need to be implemented in tens of thousands of unique locations. This is difficult. And we need to integrate complexities of all types and at all scales: biological complexities, complexities in climate, politics, industry, our complexity, other local populations, and we need to integrate all of this into a global solution. This is difficult. So we need harmony at the grassroots, the political, and the industrial levels, focused, trained on the carbon problem. We need to give industry the chance to reorganize and rebuild. We need legislation that provides leadership and that reduces the uncertainty that is currently plaguing our business environment. We need to remove that uncertainty and allow industry to capitalize on the opportunities presented by a carbon market. We need all hands on deck. Looking to any one sector is avoiding the seriousness of our black carbon problem. When examined on paper and in isolation, any emerging technology seems promising. But we also need to be holistic because these technologies interact and often compete with one another. Biofuels and agriculture are often in direct competition with each other for the same shrinking land base. A recent study estimated that 40% of Canadian agricultural lands would need to be converted to biofuels to meet our electricity needs. This is a great start at emissions reduction, but the paper was not based on existing commercial technologies, and it didn't address the limits to food production. We can't estimate the climate benefits of biofuels or forestry without considering the ripple-out effects on food. Green carbon strategies often involve compromises with other ecosystem services, and in some situations, these are not acceptable. Biological mitigation often is not transferable. There's really no one-approach-fits-all solution. In many countries, crop residues are already being returned to soil and have been for some time, so we can't count this as having additional climate benefits. In other regions, residues are used for fuel, for cooking, so we can't modify those strategies without affecting livelihood. This is a great example of how a solution might work in one region, but not transferable to another. So the solution does not lie in agriculture or forestry, or in any sector. We need to rethink, reform, and revitalize our entire energy system from top to bottom. And we need to invest in stored carbon. For every year that we delay peak emissions, the more we're handing our carbon problem to our children, expecting them to come up with clever, outlandish even, solutions for negative emissions technology. And this is never going to be in agriculture or forestry. This means carbon capture and storage, coupled either with bioenergy or direct air capture. In both of these situations, the carbon is ideally locked in the geosphere. Carbon capture on land might be cheaper, but it's not permanent, so it's risky. There are current commercial facilities that use carbon capture, so this is existing technology. But there's currently no price on sequestered CO2. So these facilities are selling their captured CO2 as a product that has value. That's got to change. We need to value carbon in the ground more than carbon in the air. And that's the only way to solve our carbon problem. We really are at a crossroads today. We have a very small window for climate stabilization, and it's getting really small. So now is the time to act, to push our policymakers, and to support industrial solutions that are sustainable. We have no time to farm out global warming solutions. We cannot rely on buying time to develop alternative technologies, because we need carbon solutions now that are food first, permanent, and scalable. It's clear from this that agriculture and forestry are not our best chance for climate change mitigation. Thank you.
Informed minds have presented both sides of this in exquisite disquisitions, and now you become the judiciary of this thing. As Morris pointed out at the beginning, it's not a matter of you're voting for the motion per se. By the way, correct me if I get this wrong, because most likely I will. It is whether or not from your first vote, which you recorded on the Great Monkey survey, what is your thought on the same motion now? And we will record whether that has changed, whether it has remained the same, or whether it has been grossly emphasized by the eloquence that you have heard here today. Morris, how long will the tabulations take? 5 minutes. Okay. And if there's any other contributions, merely to fill the time between registering your votes, if you wish to make any other comment to the members of the panel here while they're still present, please feel free. Otherwise, I'll be reduced to telling tales from Newfoundland, and you don't want to go through that. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much for all the comments. I know we're talking right now in the Canadian context, but global warming is global, so it's a world issue. So as I see and I learned in this conference, there is many help done by developed countries to help developing countries like those in Africa, right? So I'm sorry to tell you that developing countries maybe are the ones increasing this issue. I come from Mexico, and as Dr. Stewart said, once you are good economically, then you can start facing these kind of issues like global warming. In Mexico now, it's not a priority, as we have other issues like poverty. So how you, as a developed country, how you are helping those countries to actually take an action on this? Simply about population, we are 4 times Canada, so which is a lot of people emitting and a developing country trying to grow economically.
So one way is exactly this carbon sequestration by growing more forests. So basically payments for ecosystem services and offsetting carbon. So basically most of those forests are in developing countries, and especially in Latin America, where the benefits of growing more forests and avoiding forest conservation are like most effective, and as well as in China, where there has been lots of deforestation happening. But then, of course, like in terms of cutting fossil fuels from the consumption, it's basically if we could first solve the problem in developed world as well, how we replace fossil fuels. So that's kind of the big issue everywhere. But then, at least if we could transfer some technologies to developing countries, that we have like cleaner technologies in some processes, that could be one of the answers.
If you were to take a solution that is not locally land-based, but for example, carbon capture and storage, you can imagine a worldwide industry who are experts at that, taking their machines anywhere. The question is, who would pay? And the whole point about the climate change accord was that not everybody is expected to pay the same amount. So there does need to be that sort of global settlement. And I think that's the kind of solution that we need to address the point that you're making. Because the problem has to be shared by everyone, whether you're rich or you're poor. Not necessarily to the same extent. I get it. But I think the responsibility should be taken on globally, and the costs shared out, and solutions that are not local farmer land-based may be easier to implement anywhere.
Okay, thank you very much. I think before I invite Morris back up here to give us, as we should say, the results of the actual transaction, I think we should thank each of the participants who were here, give an extra special one for those who made such arduous and extended journeys to be here, for once more having a debate so much superior to those things we normally provide ourselves via News World or CTV Channel News. So thank you to all the debaters. And now the captain of the conference will take over.
So now if I could just check that people who've tried to vote have been able to vote a second time. We're trying to get a tally on the second vote, which is roughly the same as the previous round. So is anybody having difficulty that you want to wave a hand? Looks like everybody's had a chance to vote. So I think at this point then, Leanne, we can close the voting, and we'll reveal the pre-vote and the post-vote. Okay, all will be revealed. So the pre-debate situation, I agree with the proposition, was over 50% there, 54%. I do not agree. It was down at about 9% by the looks of it, and then quite a large unsure population. After the debate, as you can see, the unsure population decreased substantially, and it looks like the opposition has won an awful lot of votes there, to the point that they're now into about 45%, and the proposition is down to about 35%. So I think that does give us an indication that we've had very high quality debate. I want to congratulate both teams, but particularly the opposition. I think you pulled it off remarkably well.